Imagine standing on a rocky outcrop in the Scottish Highlands, gazing across the windswept landscape. The mist parts momentarily, revealing a land seemingly untouched by time. But beneath your feet lies something extraordinary, something that defies conventional scientific understanding. It's not the ancient rock formations or the unique ecosystems that make this place special. It's the people. For centuries, scientists believed they understood human genetic migration patterns across Europe, but Scotland harbors a genetic anomaly so profound that when it was first discovered in 2019, geneticists questioned their most fundamental assumptions about human evolution. "How could this possibly exist?" whispered Dr. Amira Galloway as she stared at her computer screen in the University of Edinburgh's genetics lab, the blue light illuminating her face as rain lashed against the windows. The genetic sequence before her, collected from residents of remote Scottish islands, contained markers that, according to existing models, simply shouldn't be there. Not in Europe. Not in the 21st century. Not anywhere. What Dr. Galloway discovered that stormy night would eventually upend decades of scientific consensus about human migration, force a re-examination of ancient history, and reveal that Scotland's population carries genetic markers unlike any others on Earth. This isn't just another minor variation in the human genome. It's a profound anomaly that challenges everything we thought we knew about where humans came from and how they spread across the planet. But to understand why Scotland's genetic makeup is so extraordinary, we must first understand what makes it so different from anywhere else in the world, and more importantly, why this matters not just to Scots, but to every person alive today. The story begins not with complex science, but with a simple question. How did humans come to inhabit the far corners of our planet? For decades, the narrative seemed straightforward. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, with the first major migration out of Africa occurring approximately 70,000 years ago. These early travelers spread across Asia and Europe, eventually reaching the Americas across the Bering Land Bridge. Each population adapted to local environments, developing slight genetic variations, but remaining fundamentally the same species with a common origin. This out-of-Africa model became scientific orthodoxy, supported by fossil evidence, archaeological findings, and later genetic studies. When researchers began mapping human DNA in the early 2000s, the genetic evidence seemed to confirm this single origin theory. Populations furthest from Africa showed predictable genetic markers consistent with this gradual outward migration. Europeans, in particular, displayed a relatively homogeneous genetic structure, with variations that could be easily explained by known historical migrations. Neolithic farmers from the Middle East, Bronze Age migrations from the Eurasian steppe, and later movements like the Roman Empire's expansion. Scotland, sitting at the northwestern edge of Europe, was expected to show a typical Western European genetic profile, perhaps with slightly more Norse influence due to Viking invasions and Celtic markers from ancient migrations. Nothing extraordinary was anticipated when the Scottish Genome Project began collecting DNA samples in 2015 under the leadership of Professor Graham Keating, a geneticist who had spent decades studying European population genetics. "We expected to find confirmation of what we already knew," Professor Keating explained during a lecture at Oxford in 2021. Scotland's genetic makeup should have been a straightforward blend of ancient European farmer DNA, Bronze Age migrations, Celtic and Germanic contributions, with some Nordic influence. Nothing that would raise eyebrows. The project began conventionally enough. Teams collected DNA samples from thousands of Scots, focusing particularly on families with deep roots in specific regions, people whose ancestors had lived in the same areas for generations. The goal was to create a comprehensive genetic map of Scotland, similar to projects completed in Iceland, Finland, and other European nations. But as the first results came in, anomalies began to appear. Initially, these were dismissed as contamination or sequencing errors, common issues in genetic research. But as more samples showed the same unexpected patterns, particularly from the Hebrides, Orkney, and remote highland communities, researchers realized something unprecedented was emerging. Dr. Amira Galloway, then a postdoctoral researcher specializing in population genetics, was tasked with analyzing these outlier samples. A meticulous scientist with a reputation for catching what others missed, She began noticing patterns in the anomalous sequences, patterns that made no sense according to established migration models. The first thing that struck me was a particular haplotype, a set of genetic markers that tend to be inherited together, present in about 12% of our Highland samples, Dr. Galloway explained. This specific genetic signature contained elements we'd expect to find in Aboriginal Australian populations, not in Northern Europe. According to everything we knew about human migration, these markers shouldn't exist anywhere near Scotland. This discovery might seem like a minor curiosity to non-geneticists, but in the scientific world, it was equivalent to finding a tropical reef in Antarctica. These genetic markers had never been documented in any European population, and their presence in Scotland defied explanation through known historical migrations or contact between populations. The scientific community's initial response was skepticism. When Professor Keating and Dr. Galloway published their preliminary findings in the Journal of Human Genetics in late 2019, the paper was met with criticism and suggestions of methodological errors. Some prominent geneticists suggested contamination of samples or sequencing errors must be responsible. I received emails suggesting we should check our equipment, Professor Keating recalled with a wry smile, as if we hadn't already done that a dozen times. But the Scottish team was confident in their methods. They repeated the analysis with fresh samples, different sequencing technologies, and invited external laboratories to verify their findings. The results remained consistent. Approximately 12 to 14% of individuals from certain Scottish regions carried genetic markers that had never been documented in any European population. Markers that most closely resembled those found in isolated populations thousands of miles away, with no known historical connection to Scotland. This was just the beginning of a mystery that would deepen considerably as researchers expanded their investigation, seeking to understand not just what made Scotland's genetic profile unique, but how it came to be, and what it might tell us about human history that conventional archaeology and historical records had missed entirely. As we delve deeper into this genetic mystery, we must first understand why this discovery was so shocking to the scientific community. What exactly makes these Scottish genetic markers so unusual? And why couldn't they be explained by known historical migrations? The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA, with humans sharing 99.9% of this genetic code with one another. The remaining 0.1% accounts for all human diversity, our different appearances, disease susceptibilities, and ancestral markers. Within this tiny fraction of variation lies the key to tracing human migration and evolution. When scientists study population genetics, they often focus on specific markers that tend to be inherited together. These groupings, called haplotypes, can serve as genetic signatures for particular ancestral populations. By mapping these signatures across the globe, geneticists have created increasingly detailed pictures of human migration throughout history. Prior to the Scottish discovery, the genetic map of Europe showed clear patterns. Southern Europeans carried more genetic markers associated with early Neolithic farmers who spread agriculture northward from the Middle East beginning around 9,000 years ago. Northern and Eastern Europeans showed stronger signals from the Yamnaya, Bronze Age steppe herders who migrated into Europe around 5,000 years ago, likely bringing Indo-European languages with them. Western Europeans, including the British Isles, displayed a mixture of these influences, along with markers from indigenous Western European hunter-gatherers. Later historical migrations, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, added further layers to this genetic palimpsest, but the overall picture remained consistent with archaeological and historical evidence. What the Scottish Genome Project discovered, however, was something entirely different. The anomalous Scottish markers don't fit anywhere in this established European genetic history, explained Dr. Elias Winters, a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute who was brought in to verify the Scottish team's findings. These are not just minor variations of known European haplogroups. They represent entirely distinct genetic lineages that, according to our previous understanding, should not exist in Europe at all. The mystery deepened when researchers compared these markers to genetic databases from around the world. The closest matches weren't found in neighboring countries or even across Eurasia. They appeared in populations separated from Scotland by vast oceans. Some elements of these genetic signatures bear similarities to markers found in indigenous Australian populations, while others resemble patterns seen in isolated communities in Southeast Asia, Dr. Galloway explained. But they're not exact matches to any known population. It's as if they represent a distinct branch of humanity that somehow became isolated in Scotland. This is where the mystery takes us into uncharted territory. How could genetic markers associated with such distant populations appear in Scotland with no historical record of contact between these groups? The conventional human migration models offered no explanation. To investigate further, the team expanded their sampling, focusing particularly on individuals whose families had inhabited the same regions of Scotland for many generations. They also began examining ancient DNA extracted from archaeological remains across Scotland, seeking to determine how far back these unusual genetic markers might be traced. The results were astonishing. Analysis of remains from a 4,000-year-old burial site in the Outer Hebrides revealed the presence of these same anomalous genetic markers, proving they weren't the result of recent migrations, but had been present in the Scottish gene pool for millennia. This finding eliminated any possibility that these markers arrived through historically documented migrations, Professor Keating noted. These genetic signatures predated the Viking Age, the Roman period, even the Celtic migrations. They were already present in Scotland during the Bronze Age. Further analysis of ancient DNA samples from across Scotland revealed a fascinating pattern. The anomalous markers were most concentrated in coastal regions, particularly the Western Isles and the northern coast. They appeared less frequently in inland areas and were almost entirely absent from southern Scotland and northern England. This distribution pattern suggested that whatever brought these genetic signatures to Scotland likely arrived by sea, and apparently made limited incursions inland. But from where and when? To answer these questions, the research team turned to advanced dating techniques and population modeling. By analyzing mutation rates in the anomalous genetic sequences, they could estimate approximately when these lineages diverged from other human populations. The molecular clock analysis gave us a divergence date of approximately 50,000 years ago, Dr. Galloway revealed. This suggests that the population carrying these genetic markers separated from other human lineages during the early waves of migration out of Africa, but followed a path unlike any we've previously documented. This timeline presented an extraordinary possibility. While most human migrations into Europe came via the Middle East and Southeastern Europe, some group of early humans may have taken an entirely different route, one that somehow led them to Scotland without leaving significant genetic traces in the intervening regions. But how could this be possible? The geography seems to make such a migration implausible. To reach Scotland without passing through the rest of Europe would require a maritime journey far beyond the capabilities historians have attributed to humans of that era. This is where the mystery deepens further, and where conventional explanations begin to falter. The scientific team found themselves facing a profound question. Were they discovering evidence of a previously unknown migration route into Europe? Or was there another explanation for these genetic anomalies? As researchers continued to analyze both modern and ancient DNA samples from across Scotland, new patterns emerged that made the mystery even more perplexing. The anomalous genetic markers weren't distributed randomly throughout the Scottish population. They appeared with striking regularity in people with specific physical characteristics. We noticed that individuals carrying higher percentages of these unusual markers frequently shared certain traits, noted Dr. Fiona Maxwell, a physical anthropologist who joined the research team in 2020. Distinctive cranial features, unusual ratios in bone density, and certain dental characteristics appeared with statistically significant frequency in this population. These physical differences were subtle, not immediately apparent to casual observation, but consistent enough to suggest that whatever introduced these genetic markers into the Scottish population had influenced more than just invisible DNA sequences. It had left physical traces that had persisted for thousands of years. Even more intriguing was the discovery that these genetic markers correlated with certain rare metabolic adaptations. Individuals carrying the highest percentage of the anomalous genes showed remarkable efficiency in processing certain marine-based nutrients and unusual resistance to cold water conditions. The metabolic profile we're seeing in these individuals is unlike anything documented in other European populations, explained Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, a metabolic specialist consulting on the project. They show enhanced ability to synthesize vitamin D with minimal sunlight exposure and unique pathways for processing iodine-rich foods. These adaptations would be particularly advantageous in northern coastal environments with limited sunlight and marine-based diets. Such adaptations might seem logical for a population living in northern Scotland, but the genetic basis for these traits differed from similar adaptations seen in other northern populations like the Inuit or Scandinavians. Instead of developing through the gradual process of natural selection that typically produces such adaptations, these traits appeared to have arrived fully formed, as if the population that brought them to Scotland had already been adapted to similar conditions elsewhere. This peculiarity led the research team to examine migration models that had previously been considered implausible. Could a maritime adapted population have reached Scotland directly, bypassing the conventional land routes through Europe? When we started modeling possible migration routes based on ocean currents and prehistoric coastlines, some surprising possibilities emerged, said Dr. Jonas Campbell, a paleoclimatologist who specializes in prehistoric sea levels and coastal changes. During certain periods, particularly around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, circumpolar ocean currents could have facilitated maritime movement along coastal routes that no longer exist today. Dr. Campbell's models suggested that during this period, when sea levels were significantly lower due to glaciation, coastlines extended much further than they do now, potentially creating a series of now-submerged coastal plains, islands, and peninsulas that could have served as stepping stones for maritime-adapted populations. This hypothesis gained support when researchers discovered that some of the genetic markers present in the Scottish samples showed similarities not just to Southeast Asian and Oceanian populations, but also to ancient DNA recovered from now-submerged Sundaland, the expanded landmass that once connected many islands of Southeast Asia when sea levels were lower. We're potentially looking at a coastal migration route that followed the expanded glacial period coastlines, Professor Keating explained. A route that may have continued far further north than we previously imagined possible for early humans. But this theory faced significant challenges. Such a migration would have required maritime capabilities far beyond what archaeologists have traditionally attributed to humans of this era. While early watercraft like rafts and dugout canoes are known to have existed, the kind of vessels needed for extended ocean journeys were thought to have developed much later in human history. Furthermore, any population following such a route would likely have left genetic traces along the way. Why would these markers appear concentrated in Scotland with minimal presence elsewhere? The research team broadened their search, analyzing samples from coastal populations across Western Europe, Scandinavia, and the North Atlantic islands. They found traces of the same genetic signatures in the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and coastal Norway, but at much lower frequencies than in Scotland, and virtually nowhere else. The distribution pattern suggests a population that was highly adapted to maritime environments and remained primarily coastal, noted Dr. Galloway. But Scotland, particularly the Western Isles and northern coastal regions, appears to have been their primary settlement area, or at least, the area where their genetic contribution remained most concentrated over time. As the team continued mapping these genetic markers across the landscape, correlating them with archaeological sites and geographical features, another pattern emerged. The highest concentrations appeared near locations with unusual geological formations, particularly natural harbors adjacent to cave systems and distinctive rock formations. Dr. Alexander Rivera, an archaeologist specializing in prehistoric coastal settlements, began examining these locations for evidence of ancient habitation. What he found added yet another layer to the mystery. At several sites where the genetic markers appear most concentrated, we discovered unusual archaeological features unlike typical Neolithic or Bronze Age Scottish settlements, Dr. Rivera reported. These include distinctive stone structures with astronomical alignments, unusual burial practices, and artifacts crafted from materials not native to Scotland. Carbon dating placed these sites between 9,000 and 12,000 years ago, after the last ice age but before the arrival of agriculture in Scotland. This period, known as the Mesolithic, was previously thought to be sparsely populated by hunter-gatherer groups similar to those across northern Europe. The new discoveries suggested something quite different, a culturally distinct population with technologies and practices that set them apart from other European Mesolithic groups. Most intriguing were the astronomical alignments found at several sites. Stone structures erected by this mysterious population appeared calibrated to track not just solar events like solstices, common in many prehistoric cultures, but specific stellar alignments with southern hemisphere constellations. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these structures suggests origins in the southern hemisphere, noted Dr. Sophia Winters, an archaeoastronomer who studied the sites. They track stellar movements that would be familiar to someone from Australia or Southeast Asia, but would have no obvious significance to a population that evolved in the northern hemisphere. This evidence pointed toward a remarkable possibility. The genetic anomalies in Scotland might represent the last traces of a maritime civilization that had developed sophisticated navigational astronomy, enabling them to undertake transoceanic journeys long before such capabilities were thought to exist. A people who had followed the coastlines of the Ice Age world, eventually finding their way to Scotland, where some aspect of the landscape or environment caused them to settle in greater numbers than elsewhere. But why Scotland specifically? What drew them to this particular corner of Europe? And perhaps most importantly, why had their presence remained genetically isolated enough to be detectable thousands of years later? The answers might lie in Scotland's unique geological and geographical characteristics during the early post-glacial period. As the research team expanded their investigation to include paleoclimate data, geological studies, and more detailed archaeological surveys, a clearer picture began to emerge of what might have made Scotland so attractive to these mysterious maritime travelers. Scotland experienced a unique set of conditions following the last ice age, explained Dr. Campbell. As the ice sheets retreated around 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, they left behind a dramatically different landscape than what we see today. Sea levels were lower, exposing additional land, particularly in the Western Isles. The melting ice created a complex system of lakes, rivers, and fjords, with rich marine resources and protected harbors. This post-glacial environment would have been particularly hospitable to a population adapted to maritime living, offering abundant fishing grounds, natural harbors, and cave systems that provided shelter from the harsh northern climate. But Scotland offered something else, something that might explain why this population settled there in greater numbers than elsewhere along their hypothetical migration route. Dr. Meredith Hansen, a geologist specializing in rare earth elements, made a discovery that potentially connected the unusual Scottish genetics to the equally unusual Scottish landscape. The regions where we find the highest concentration of these genetic markers correlate remarkably well with areas rich in certain rare minerals, Dr. Hansen reported, particularly deposits of pitchblende and other uranium-bearing ores that are relatively rare globally but occur with unusual frequency in parts of the Scottish Highlands. While these minerals have modern importance for their radioactive properties, they also possess distinctive visual characteristics. Pitchblende in particular has a distinctive black, shiny appearance unlike common rocks. Archaeological evidence suggested these materials held special significance for the mysterious population, appearing frequently in ritual contexts and crafted artifacts found at their settlement sites. We believe these materials may have held cultural or religious significance that drew them to settle in these specific areas, proposed Dr. Rivera. The distribution of their settlements correlates so precisely with these geological features that it cannot be coincidental. This geological connection offered a potential explanation for why this population might have concentrated in Scotland rather than continuing their migration or settling evenly along coastlines. If these particular minerals held special significance in their culture, perhaps as materials for tools, pigments, or ritual objects, Scotland would have represented an unprecedented treasure trove worth establishing permanent settlements around. But the most extraordinary breakthrough came when the research team combined their genetic data with linguistic analysis of Scotland's oldest place names and mythological traditions. Dr. Gabriel Knox, a linguist specializing in prehistoric language reconstruction, identified peculiar patterns in certain ancient Scottish place names that defied classification within Indo-European language families. These names, primarily attached to coastal features and certain islands, contained phonemic elements that bore striking similarities to Austronesian and Australian Aboriginal language patterns. These linguistic remnants appear most concentrated in precisely the same regions where the genetic markers show highest frequency, Dr. Knox noted. It suggests that fragments of an ancient, non-Indo-European language somehow persisted in these areas long enough to influence place naming, despite subsequent waves of Celtic, Norse, and English linguistic influence. Even more compelling were connections to Scottish folklore and mythology. The ancient tales of Scotland, particularly those from the Western Isles and Highland coastal regions, contain accounts of a mysterious people called various names: the Sea Folk, the First People, or in Gaelic, Na Daoin Thanig Roim, the people who came before. These legendary figures were described as possessing extraordinary navigational abilities, unusual physical characteristics, and profound knowledge of astronomy and the natural world. They were said to have arrived from beyond the southern stars, and to have taught the ancestors of the Scots how to build certain types of boats, navigate by the stars, and locate specific resources within the landscape. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as typical folklore, similar to the fairy tales and origin myths found throughout European cultures. But when examined in light of the genetic and archaeological discoveries, these legends took on new significance. What's remarkable is the specific technical knowledge attributed to these legendary people, noted Dr. Fiona Maxwell. The boat-building techniques described in some of these ancient tales include design elements found in traditional watercraft from Oceania, construction methods that wouldn't have been known in prehistoric Scotland through any conventional historical contact. The convergence of genetic evidence, archaeological discoveries, geological correlations, linguistic remnants, and folklore presented an extraordinary possibility that Scotland had indeed been reached by maritime travelers from the far side of the world thousands of years before conventional history suggested such contact was possible. This hypothesis represented such a dramatic revision of human prehistory that many in the scientific community remained deeply skeptical. Alternative explanations were proposed. Perhaps the genetic markers represented an unknown ancient European population that had been absorbed elsewhere but remained isolated in Scotland. Perhaps the similarities to Oceanian genetics were coincidental convergent evolution rather than evidence of direct contact. But as the Scottish research team continued accumulating evidence, these alternative explanations became increasingly difficult to sustain. The specific nature of the genetic markers, their correlation with distinctive physical traits, the archaeological evidence, and the linguistic connections all pointed toward a conclusion that, however improbable, seemed increasingly difficult to dismiss. Scotland had been reached by maritime voyagers who had traveled from the opposite side of the world, using navigational capabilities far beyond what conventional archaeology attributed to humans of that era. This revelation didn't just challenge our understanding of Scottish prehistory, it forced a fundamental reconsideration of human capabilities and the history of global exploration. If this hypothesis were correct, humans had achieved transoceanic travel tens of thousands of years earlier than previously believed, possessed astronomical knowledge far more sophisticated than assumed, and maintained cultural and technological traditions that enabled them to navigate across vast distances with remarkable precision. But perhaps most significant was what this discovery revealed about human adaptability and ingenuity. If a population had indeed traveled from Southeast Asia or Oceania to Scotland during the Ice Age, they would have encountered dramatically different environments along the way, from tropical waters to Arctic conditions, and developed technologies and cultural practices to survive these transitions. What we're potentially seeing here is evidence of human adaptability that exceeds our previous understanding, noted Professor Keating. Not gradual adaptation through natural selection over many generations, but cultural and technological adaptation that allowed rapid movement through radically different environments within a single lifetime or a few generations. As the research progressed, the team began searching for additional evidence that might conclusively prove or disprove their extraordinary hypothesis. They turned to cutting-edge technologies and interdisciplinary approaches, combining genetic analysis with isotope studies, advanced archaeological techniques, and computer modeling of ancient maritime conditions. Dr. Galloway led an effort to extract and analyze ancient DNA from skeletal remains found at the distinctive archaeological sites, seeking to build a more complete genetic profile of this mysterious population. The results revealed another surprising aspect of the mystery. The mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively through the maternal line, shows the strongest connection to Southeast Asian and Oceanian populations, Dr. Galloway explained. But the Y chromosome analysis, representing paternal lineages, shows more diversity, with some lineages connecting to Asian populations and others showing European origins. This pattern suggested that the maritime voyagers who reached Scotland might have been primarily female, with subsequent generations involving partnerships with males from local European populations. Such a gender imbalance in the migrating population would be unusual but not unprecedented. Certain historical migrations have shown similar patterns, particularly when small groups were separated from larger populations through disaster or conflict. The isotope analysis of ancient teeth and bones provided additional insights. By examining the ratio of certain elements in skeletal remains, scientists can determine where an individual lived during different stages of life, as different regions leave distinctive chemical signatures in developing bones and teeth. Several individuals from these ancient sites show isotope profiles indicating they spent their early childhood in environments completely unlike Scotland, reported Dr. James Moore, an isotope specialist. The specific strontium, oxygen, and carbon isotope ratios in their teeth are consistent with tropical coastal environments, not Northern Europe. This evidence suggested that at least some of these individuals had physically made the journey from distant regions within a single lifetime. They weren't just descendants of earlier migrants but had themselves traveled enormous distances. Computer modeling of Ice Age maritime conditions, led by oceanographer Dr. Elena Rodriguez, revealed potential routes that such voyagers might have followed. Her team identified a series of coastal pathways that would have been navigable with relatively simple watercraft, following prevailing currents and winds that could have facilitated movement northward along the Asian coast, across the North Pacific, and eventually around to the North Atlantic. The journey would have been enormously challenging, Dr. Rodriguez acknowledged, but our models show it was physically possible. During certain seasons, the prevailing currents would have actually assisted movement along these routes, and the expanded coastlines of the Ice Age would have provided more opportunities for shelter and resource gathering than exist today. Archaeological evidence continued to accumulate as well. Examination of ancient tools found at the distinctive Scottish sites revealed manufacturing techniques unlike those used by known European Mesolithic cultures, but strikingly similar to methods documented in ancient Southeast Asian and Australian Aboriginal traditions. The stone knapping techniques, the specific angles of percussion, and the finishing methods match patterns seen in Southeast Asia and Australia, noted Dr. Rivera. These aren't techniques that would be independently invented. They represent specific cultural traditions passed down through generations. Perhaps most compelling were the discoveries of actual watercraft remains preserved in Scotland's peat bogs. In 2021, a remarkably preserved partial hull was uncovered in a bog near Ullapool on Scotland's northwest coast. Carbon dating placed it at approximately 8,700 years old, firmly in the Mesolithic period, but its construction utilized techniques previously documented only in traditional Polynesian and Southeast Asian boat building. The hull shows a sophisticated somplank construction using specific binding techniques and waterproofing methods that have no precedent in European boat-building traditions of any era, explained Dr. Natalie Chun, a specialist in ancient maritime technologies. But these same techniques appear in traditional boat-building practices across the Pacific. As this extraordinary collection of evidence continued to grow, the scientific community's initial skepticism began to give way to serious consideration of the Scottish team's hypothesis. While debate remained vigorous, an increasing number of researchers acknowledged that the traditional models of human migration and prehistoric capabilities might need significant revision. The implications extended far beyond Scotland. If humans had indeed achieved such maritime capabilities at such an early date, similar evidence might exist elsewhere. Other instances of long-distance contact previously dismissed as impossible or coincidental might deserve re-examination. This discovery forces us to reconsider what prehistoric humans were capable of, reflected Professor Keating. It suggests our ancestors were not just passive victims of environmental conditions and geographical barriers, but actively explored and navigated the world with more sophistication than we've given them credit for. For Scotland itself, the implications were profound. The unique genetic heritage discovered within its population represented not just a scientific curiosity, but a direct connection to an extraordinary chapter of human exploration and adaptation, one that had remained hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. The Scottish government, recognizing the significance of these findings, established a dedicated research institute in 2022, bringing together experts from genetics, archaeology, linguistics, oceanography, and indigenous cultural studies to continue investigating this remarkable heritage. Indigenous scholars from Australia and Southeast Asia were invited to participate, bringing traditional knowledge that might help interpret the archaeological and genetic evidence. These collaborations produced unexpected insights, as traditional stories from Aboriginal Australian and Oceanian cultures contained accounts that seemed to mirror, from the opposite perspective, the legends preserved in Scottish folklore, tales of ancient voyagers who had traveled beyond the northern stars and never returned. Dr. Michaela Jarrah, an Aboriginal Australian scholar participating in the research, noted striking parallels between certain Scottish artifacts and traditional Aboriginal astronomical knowledge. Some of the stone arrangements found in Scotland encode stellar information that aligns precisely with traditional knowledge preserved in our culture, Dr. Jarrah explained. These aren't vague similarities. They're specific technical astronomical concepts that would be meaningful only to someone with knowledge of Southern Hemisphere celestial navigation. The converging evidence from these diverse fields of study made the extraordinary hypothesis increasingly difficult to dismiss. At some point during or shortly after the last ice age, maritime voyagers from the vicinity of Southeast Asia or Australia had reached Scotland, bringing with them distinctive genetic markers, cultural practices, technological knowledge, and astronomical understanding that had persisted, in fragmentary form, into the present day. The discovery revealed not just an unknown chapter of Scottish prehistory but a fundamental truth about humanity itself. Our species' remarkable capacity for exploration, adaptation, and the transmission of knowledge across generations and vast distances. These ancient voyagers, whoever they were, had achieved something extraordinary, and their legacy lived on in the distinctive genetic heritage of Scotland's people. As research continues, the full story of these remarkable travelers and their journey remains to be uncovered. But already, their discovery has transformed our understanding of human prehistory and capabilities. Scotland's unique genetic heritage, once a scientific anomaly, has become a window into an age of exploration far more ancient and more extraordinary than we ever imagined. What we've found in Scotland is not just a collection of unusual genetic markers, Dr. Galloway reflected. It's evidence of human courage, ingenuity, and determination that crossed oceans and millennia to reach us. These ancient voyagers remind us that exploration is fundamental to our nature as a species, and that our ancestors were capable of far more than we've given them credit for. The study of Scotland's unique genetic heritage continues to yield new insights, with researchers now examining how these ancient genetic contributions might influence modern health outcomes, adaptations to climate change, and cultural resilience. What began as a scientific anomaly has become a gateway to understanding human capabilities and connections that span the globe and reach back to the dawn of modern humanity. As we stand now on those same Scottish shores where these ancient voyagers may have first landed, we're reminded that human history is far more complex, more interconnected, and more remarkable than we previously imagined, and that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are hidden within ourselves, written in the genetic code that connects us not just to our immediate ancestors but to bold explorers who crossed oceans to create new beginnings in distant lands. In the ancient markers carried within Scotland's people lies testament to humanity's oldest truth, that no horizon is too distant, no journey too impossible for those with the vision to imagine what lies beyond and the courage to sail toward it.